Speak to our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Hello to you,
Hey,
Doug.
Will.
There are some critics over this delegation. Some say it's the wrong group, and some say it's at the worst time. Why is that?
Well, you're right. The critics have been unsparing, and the critics mainly, obviously, Ukraine, but also in the U.S., Europe, members of NATO. What have they been saying? The criticism ranges from this is a laughingstock mediation mission, mediation in quotes, to they have absolutely no leverage compared to the real global powers such as China, which could have some bearing on this conflict if it really had the will or the political will, to they are not neutral. This is where the criticism is. I'll start with the "we are not neutral" plank. You have 6 nations taking part in this mission, and what's interesting is while more than a dozen African nations failed to condemn the Russian invasion early in the days last year, UN resolution. 4 of the nations on this mission abstained from that resolution condemning Russia's invasion. So you have one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest one, South Africa. You have Senegal. You have the Republic of Congo, and you have Uganda. Those 4 nations, that is 4 out of the 6 on this team, refused to vote, abstain from condemning. You do have 2 who are represented in this delegation, Egypt and Zambia, and they did vote to condemn Russia's invasion. So you have this neutrality problem here, a delegation whose members are not seen as neutral and at worst seen as beholden to Moscow for various things from, as you mentioned, dependence on grain and fertilizer and the goodwill of Vladimir Putin to continue exporting that grain and fertilizer. The neutrality problem, though, goes to the heart. Look at South Africa. All roads in this delegation really lead to its most influential member, South Africa. Last month, you had the U.S. ambassador to South Africa essentially accusing Pretoria of supplying Russia, loading up a Russian boat at a port in South Africa with weapons and ammunition for Russia. Which would suggest that it's not too neutral in this conflict. Obviously denied by South Africa, but they are investigating it right now. You have had further accusations that South Africa has not been an entirely honest broker when it comes to its chumminess with Vladimir Putin, that has been more willing to give the benefit of the doubt to Vladimir Putin in this conflict. That is a very big factor. So the economic factors, that dependence on grain and fertilizer, Russia's goodwill, the sense of this is not exactly a neutral group of nations here, and the sense that they are really small fry, that unless the global powers with more vested interests really get involved in this, they won't be able to do anything. The African powers, the critics say, should try to solve their problems at home right now. There's a raging civil war in Sudan. Perhaps they can start there.
Are these talks taking place in Saint Petersburg after the annual economic forum in the city? What are you expecting from Saturday's talks?
Very little. And that's not me being just, editorializing and cynical. I say very little because Vladimir Putin himself has signaled and explicitly said in recent days, basically that the Ukrainian offensive is already being essentially crushed, that it has zero chance of success. So the line right now being pushed in the state-run Russian media is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive, as it's being called, is essentially over before it started. Obviously a line that Ukraine would take sharp exception with, and does take sharp exception with. Putin, obviously, the African leaders are coming to Putin with this notion. I sort of see it as a false equivalency notion, that both sides, in theory, are ready to sit down at the table and negotiate honestly and in good faith. Now, look back at the Minsk agreements. All the sides went to the tables with the same sort of notion in their head, that all sides would negotiate in good faith. And the critics would say Russia not only wasn't in good faith, never negotiated. One of the premises of the African delegation's so-called mediation mission is that Russia should withdraw its troops from the territories it has captured since February 2022 last year. That's nearly 20% of Ukrainian territory it occupies. There is not a snowball's chance in hell, Will, given what Vladimir Putin has been saying in recent days, weeks, and months, that the Russians are ready to accept any withdrawal from the territory that they have taken. So that is another reason why the very premise of this peace plan is already very flawed. It is sort of has its DNA has a real mutation in it. It's just not going to work.
What are Ukraine's allies in NATO, the U.S., Europe saying about the mediation effort?
Officially, the U.S. and Europe and NATO aren't going to dismiss it out of hand. Officially, they are being cautiously supportive. That's the most diplomatic language you can use. Cautiously supportive. But look, privately, Off the record, of course, I think they basically would agree with a lot of what I was just saying, that this mission has absolutely zero chance of bearing any fruit whatsoever. Wrong group, wrong time, and also that this comes on the heels. Remember, NATO ministers just met this week to prepare that big summit in Vilnius next month in mid-July. And while they're ruling out letting Ukraine in as a NATO member in the near future, they have vowed as support as long as it takes in terms of supplying political support, weapons, and ammunition that Ukraine needs, and even training pilots for those planes. The West right now is trying to push as much as it can, as long as it takes is still the official language, to ensure that Ukraine has the best chance of capturing as much territory to put it in the best possible negotiating position when and if the time comes to negotiate. That time is not here yet, which is why for most in the West, this African mediation mission, I say once again in quotes, is premature.